Every single piece of technology hardware in the last 20 years has been directly influenced by Apple's industrial design. But every single one of those people that's copied Apple's industrial design has copied the wrong thing. Because what happened is in the late 90s, early 2000s, when Johnny Ive designed the iMac, it was to stand out against this sea of beige boxes where every other computer looked exactly the same. And this
Mm.
thing was like in another universe. And that was the thing that people should have been copying, which is when everything else looks like X, we're going to make it look like Y.
Paul, thank you so much for agreeing to come on One More Question. It's really good to have you here today.
Thank you. No, it's really nice to be here. It's a it's a conversation I'm really looking forward to. I've never been asked to be on an African podcast before, so I'm looking forward to it.
Well, we're going to talk about global versus African. So in my head, I used to believe I was a global brand, but now maybe I'm rethinking that. So, so the first question I ask everyone is, what is branding? But I think what's more relevant, in the conversation we were having just before we hit the button was this idea of identity versus
Yeah.
branding. Like, how do you see those two different thoughts, and what do you have to share about that as a thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what is branding is one of those red herring questions, right? Because you can get a million different answers because the very thing itself is somewhat amorphous because you're dealing with subjectivity and you're dealing with intangibleness. And so you're always going to get multiple definitions. I think that the easy way to distinguish, so I studied marketing at college many moons ago, and one of the electives was corporate identity. And so we're learning about this 30 years ago. And I think that the way I would frame the difference, and it's an arbitrary definition change. So if anybody's listening, and please bear with me, I think in the corporate identity era, we were very focused on what is the unique identity of this company? How do we express what makes this company, tick in a visual and verbal fashion, primarily visual in those days. And so it was very insular and very focused on like what makes the company stand out. I think when we went to the branding era and we shifted from talking about corporate identity, start talking about branding, it became much more customer driven. It's much more about what will the customer want, what will they buy into, what is it that's going to make us stand out from others, relative to that customer. But I think the challenge that we found, and we've certainly seen this in the last 10, 15 years, is that when we use that branding frame, we've narrowed everything so much. There is this globalized homogeneity that's happened, and so everybody looks the same. The logos look the same, the names sound the same, the typefaces look the same, the voice sound and tone is the same. We have seen this massive genericization of the economy, if you like,
Mm.
under the guise of branding. And I think that if we were to step back, it might be useful for us to remind ourselves of some of those tenets of identity. Not because I think there's a fundamental difference between branding and corporate identity, but I think that when we use that frame of corporate identity, it helps us to get back to this idea that we're trying to express what makes the company unique and special and what makes it tick
Mm.
and a visual reflection of its DNA, which I think will help us get away from this kind of this narrowing aperture of taste that we've seen.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because you see, I guess as branding has become more mainstream, as in the craft of branding has become more mainstream, and people are watching, when big companies rebrand, there's critiques online, and you're seeing
Yep.
TikTok videos, and
Yep.
whereas roll back a while and no one really cared, the company had to spend money
Yep.
to actually tell everyone that they changed their branding. No one
Yep.
actually noticed, and there was a subsect of people like you and me that were having these discussions about this, but now it's sort of bubbled up
Yep.
into the mainstream, and you see a lot of that thinking also moving into personal branding, and that the
Yep.
leaders of the company also need to be a brand and have a brand. and
Yep.
and I find this quite interesting, because when people pursue personal branding more than company branding, they try and create something that's almost not there. There's this smoke and mirrors that's sort of being thrown up, and I find, companies that build really good brands and then deliver very poor service, or if you see someone in a sort of social media setting and then you encounter them in real life and there's a big difference, the fall is quite real. And I think if people tap into that identity piece, what's special, what makes me unique, the opportunity for that to happen is diminished somewhat.
Yeah, it's funny when you're talking about the personal branding, 'cause I think that we obviously see an incredible amount of artifice in the social media influencer space. There aren't very many 24-year-olds who can, drop the money on a Lamborghini, for example. But, there are enough of them on social media that it creates this impression that it's possible for all,
Mm.
and that you can live, and they create these false ideas of the lifestyles that they lead, and what have you. And in some ways it's really smart because it is using, I've written before about how, great brands are wielders of artifice, right? We this idea of authenticity is kind of a nonsensical thought, because what is authenticity, right? We can be authentically fake all the time. But I think the folks that are really, really good are very good at building these worlds of artifice. Ralph Lauren has been doing it forever, like Polo. I mean, it's a completely invented world that he associated the brand with. But when you build these worlds of artifice so well, you can't see the cracks. You know what I mean? And so they become quite compelling as places to hang out in and be a part of as consumers.
Mm. And I guess it's also that, that idea that there's a desire, there's an acquisition to be had. When you're standing on the outside looking in, you feel deficient, and when you're on the inside looking out, if you're on the inside, you feel like you belong, but you also can look out at other people who don't have. And I think there's, a lot of this has been accelerated in the internet age, that people can acquire these things. I mean, unboxing is an insane
Yeah,
idea, that we watch other
it's true.
people open things on the
It's true.
internet, and not just a few people, millions of people watch somebody open a phone or a laptop or a shoe or a t-shirt or a scarf. It's like this, it's almost like a collective insanity that we've all agreed to, powered by these branded engines.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a collective insanity. I think some of it just on, especially on the unboxing stuff. It's like some of it's just really basic product information stuff. Oh, I'm thinking of buying that product. I'll watch this person unbox it, see what it comes with, see how easy it is to work it straight out of the box and stuff. And then some of it, I think, is obviously very aspirational, because often these products are things that, are very expensive and that most people aren't, are very exclusive, and most people aren't going to be able to afford them, or be able to access them.
Mm. And they also then create this whole subworld of the secondhand market, that's like a whole nother thing.
It's fascinating, and I think that this is an aside, but I think there's something really interesting. We have this bad habit of trying to overgeneralize the population around us when we're selling stuff. And we get very simplistic, and the one that I really can't stand is the idea of generational, like, segmentation. There is literally no basis in fact for, and in fact, if you look at the famous book that was written about millennials, they based so all of the things that we thought about millennials was based on one book that was based on a handful of interviews at two high schools in a wealthy suburb of Washington D.C. And then we generalize that to the entire population of like 80 odd million people in the US, and then goodness knows how many more people globally. And it makes no sense. And so the secondhand clothing example is a good one, right? Because there are a lot of people who are in this Gen Z younger age group who want to do secondhand clothing, both physically and online, because they don't want the environmental impact. So, they know that fashion is a hugely costly on the environment. So they have this thing, right? But at the very same time, you have Shein and Temu as the two most popular apps in the App Store, which are the literal opposite.
Mm.
They're environmental catastrophes, both in production and shipping and from beginning to end. And so I think we got to be real careful when we oversimplify large groups of people and we overgeneralize these things, because we can actually have a population that's very large for whom they do shop at Shein. Perhaps the same person is also shopping secondhand,
Mm.
and we have to deal with these contradictions, I think, and accept them. And those contradictions are actually what makes the world a rich place. The more we kind of try to boil people down and overgeneralize and oversimplify human beings, the more boring and the less interesting the stuff is that we then put into the world, because we're no longer reflecting that richness in any way, shape, or form.
I think, I mean, there's a lot in there, So for me, one of my like interests is when I travel the world, I try and look at the mobile phone, the telecom operators,
Yeah.
because those are some of the most generic brands that you can find, because they kind of want to
Yep.
appeal to everyone, someone who can spend 10 cents a month all the way up to
Yep.
someone who's willing to drop $500, $800 a month and wants a new phone. So there are these very sort of generic experiences, and almost by design, it's actually probably quite beautiful how generic they've managed to strip it back to in a way. But I think what we're sort of talking here is people are inherently complex things.
Yeah.
So I can
Yeah.
believe that I want to be better, a better version of myself. So if you ask me what I want to do all of these things and have all of these pieces, but at the same time, I can have behavior that goes in the direct opposite of what I'm not only telling you, but also believe. Like I fully believe it in my
Yeah.
head, and both of those versions of Ross Drake's can be true simultaneously, and I can potentially engage with products and brands and companies on either side of that sort of divide in my own
Oh,
own head.
absolutely. Absolutely. And it's a funny thing, right? Because I often think that when we use the word brand a lot, um, but we have the problem that we have this one word that has to cover a tremendous amount of ground.
Mm,
And you know how people talk about how the Inuit have hundreds of words for snow, because when you're in that environment, you need the nuances of context, right? Well, we talk about brand, but to give an example from what you were just saying, that spectrum could be things I just absolutely don't care about, like soap that I put in my washing machine. And so I always buy the same brand every time because I don't want to think about it and I just want it to work. And I know that that brand will work. Right
mm,
up to, I don't know, a super high end car or something that you incredibly aspire to, that you just desperately want. And we refer to both of those two exact things as brand. Yet
mm,
they're kind of setting off two completely different kind of human reactions. One is I just don't care. Another one is I care tremendously. So it's a very challenging thing, and I think I can understand why people who are outside of our universe get extremely frustrated when people like you and I use this word brand a lot, and they feel like it has this incredibly imprecise usage. And it's that kind of snow and Inuit problem, right? We just don't have enough language to describe what we're talking about.
yes, and I mean, I guess it's getting even more complicated now with the rise of sort of digital products. where the product and the brand are now also becoming kind of part
Yeah.
of the same thing. I mean, people ask me, like, do they think Uber has a good brand? And I think as a graphic experience, it's all right. It's, it's slick and it's well executed, but it doesn't have a lot of personality. The experience of Uber is in the app. Like, that is the product, that is the brand, that is the experience, that
Yeah.
is the sort of everything. So to your point, it's getting even more convoluted and like even more complicated at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. And look, it, you always have to be careful whenever you critique anybody else's work because you're not in the room and you're not there and you don't know the
Mm,
dynamics and you don't know how difficult that particular client is to get them to buy something or not buy something. And so like I know that there is, as you mentioned, there is a very popular thing right now to critique a lot of this work and to say, oh, that's terrible and this could be better and everything else, which, having been in the trenches, it's completely unrealistic. Sticking your concept up on the internet is like, that's dead easy. Getting a
mm.
huge corporation to buy something is really freaking hard, right?
Yeah,
Um,
100%.
and so, but with that said, I'm not a fan of the Uber corporate identity. The work, I think, is really deeply mediocre.
Mm,
Um, and the graphics are effectively wireframes. And
mm,
it's really sad because it was done by Wolf Olin, so I used to work for, and I've always held that company to an extremely high standard of creative excellence. And the thing that always made them stand out from everybody else, and the reason I joined them, was there was always an incredible joy in their work. So it was differentiating, but it was always joyful.
mm,
And Uber has no joy. There's no joy in Uber at all.
mm,
It's very austere. It's extremely emotionless. It's basically wireframes. It's kind of the most technically efficient design for a technically efficient engineering run company.
mm,
But it's such a shame because I kind of think that Uber, if you get away from its business practices and how its drivers are often really not well looked after, um, and the prices that it now charges, uh, it it is representative of freedom,
mm,
really, and genuinely so. A lot of companies talk about freedom, but they are like, it is mobility. It is the ability to get around places and do things that you couldn't have done previously, right? Anything from going out and getting drunk and not having to drive your own car home to, driving nurses around so that they can look after patients. It's a ton of different stuff there. It's an incredible richness. And I think they could have reflected that richness much more explicitly.
mm.
And I think it would have made it a much more engaging uh, brand. But from a brand experience standpoint, to your point, it's exceptional. It works really well. The cars turn up, they get you where you're going. You don't have to pay or use your wallet. Like, there's a lot of things they innovated that were really, really smart. And the very fact that you walk out of the train station. I went to Boston recently from New York. I went up and I got out at the train station, and I went up the escalator, and everybody is on their phone getting an Uber, and I just walked straight over to the taxi rank, took a cab. And it's like the cabs are like lined up, and there's people on the app getting an Uber because they'd rather wait to take the Uber than to just go get the cab.
Yes.
So the brand itself is exceptionally strong, but I think it's exceptionally strong in spite of having an incredibly weak visual identity system, um,
Mm.
which
I mean, I think,
you can get away with if there are other things that go your way.
I think this is, in there, I think there's a lesson for people who might be listening. I think it's as important that the clients, the people who own the companies, who own the brands, are available to let their creative agency do the work properly, as it is that the agencies are to show up. Because you touched on that point, that you can have the best idea on earth, but if it can't make it through the layers of boardroom, it's not going to ever see the light of day. And often the companies that are showing up in a really interesting and meaningful way, they've managed to flatten that in some sort of a way,
Yeah,
or the agency is exceptionally good at getting their idea all the way to the top. So if you are
yeah,
engaging with someone, to build you a brand, be giving them the ability to potentially make you a little bit uncomfortable and to push you into places that might not feel 100% kind of right or comfortable, and actually believing that they have good intention in what they're building is as important as the creative people pushing those ideas.
Yeah, yeah, no, I think that's true. I also think that it's partially a condition of widespread ignorance. Um, and I think that clients are ignorant, and I think agencies are often ignorant too. And it's
Mm,
the ignorance of what is the difference between a good distinctive identity and not, right? So the easiest thing in the world to buy, and hence and as a result of being the easiest thing in the world to buy, it's also the easiest thing in the world to sell, is something that looks exactly like what somebody else has done, assuming that other person is successful. So
mm,
we have seen, like, think about technology hardware, right? Every single piece of technology hardware in the last 20 years has been directly influenced by Apple's industrial design. But every single one of those people that's copied Apple's industrial design has copied the wrong thing. Because what happened is in the late 90s, early 2000s, when Johnny Ive designed the iMac, it was to stand out against this sea of beige boxes where every other computer looked exactly the same. And this
mm,
thing was like in another universe. And that was the thing that people should have been copying, which is when everything else looks like X, we're going to make it look like Y.
mm,
Instead, they made everything look like X. So the iMac created a new industrial design language for Apple, and then everybody just copied that kind of minimalist Dieter Rams inspired style.
mm,
And because they thought, well, Apple does that, and Apple's successful. In order for me to be successful, I should do that too. And unfortunately, neither the clients themselves nor the designers who either worked for them internally or externally as agencies were able to dig beneath that and say, no, no, no. What's the underlying principle? The underlying principle isn't minimalism works. The underlying principle is do something different from what everybody else is doing in order to stand out and be more distinctive and to have a unique identity of your own. And I think that's where it's a really good example, frankly.
mm.
I think it's going to take a major, like, sea change moment where somebody else comes along and does something very, very different with its industrial design around a technology product to kind of break this cycle. And it's really, it's this kind of global homogenization,
Mm.
which we're seeing, and it's, I have to be honest, it's pretty freaking boring.
I mean, I'm a big tech fan. I love to buy gadgets, so this is something that you straight into an area that I'm very passionate about. I mean, the phone that I'm currently the most desirous of is a thing called the Nothing phone, which was
Hmm.
started by Carl Pei, who's the guy who was also founded OnePlus. And it's
Yep.
just because they're doing something different. I don't
Yep.
even know if it's a good phone. I haven't even cared enough to go and figure that out. Just it's so different that I'm interesting to play because I mean I've got a Samsung and you put it next to an iPhone and it's the same thing, and you get a Google phone, put it next to
Yep.
that, also same like slab of glass, camera on the back.
But
Not interesting at all. But
but
I think this is interesting in terms of part of why people. One of the big reasons why people think they need a brand is obviously to talk about how to stand out, how to be different, how to get people to notice you.
yeah.
Um, and we had a conversation around distinctiveness versus differentiation. I think you're talking about the language there, where the principle, people saw that Apple was different, so then they just copied them because they thought that would make them different too, instead of thinking, okay, how do I be distinct in my category? How do I stand out versus all these other people?
I've been in enough corporate boardrooms with folks making decisions over the years that I actually think it's even more basic than that. It's less that they see it as making them different. It's more that Apple is successful, so if we do this, we'll be successful too.
Mm,
And you see this across the piece. I had a really funny story. A creative director friend of mine was working on a startup, and they were focused on, they were a late entrant to the erectile dysfunction medication space. So, in case anybody doesn't know, you can buy the equivalent of Viagra online. They have these doctors. They basically, I haven't gone through the process, but I think they just diagnose you online, and then you can start buying the pills, and they're much cheaper than you would have to pay for them if you were buying them branded yourself, right? And you don't have to go through your doctor and what have you. And so it's literally the easiest thing in the world to sell, right? You're selling discount penis pills. This is a very simple value proposition. This is a very easy business to get into, right? And so they did this competitive analysis, and they looked at the landscape, and they basically said, so you're coming in late. There's like 50 or 100 of these things already out there. They all look exactly the same. Here's what we need to do in order to stand out, be different, in order to capture the attention, because like this is just the sea of same that we're going to be entering. And the VC in the room said, no, stop. He said, you will make it look like that. And he pointed at Hims and said, because they are successful. And if we do what they did, we will be successful too. Mm-hmm. And that was it. Closed the story down. And you're like, that literally goes against, like, these are people who are so-called data-driven decision makers. No, because that goes against all the data, it goes against all the empirical research, it goes against everything we know about how consumers will make decisions, which is if you drop a Me Too value proposition in a Me Too skin into a very competitive Shark Tank, you're probably not going to do very well.
Mm. Or you're going to spend a ton of money on Google Ads.
Yeah, and that's not sustainable, because your unit economics is going to be negative, and then as soon as you run out of VC funding, your business closes. Mm. And your now annoyed customers have to, however many you have to go and find one of the 30 odd other companies to buy from.
But they'll just switch kind of immediately.
But I think, sorry.
No, you go.
No, I was just going to say, but I think that's indicative of this, when I talk about like widespread ignorance around what you should be focusing on versus not focusing on. I think that is just a very extreme example of like where you have a business decision maker who just literally is clueless about the subject, but has an idea in his head about what works and what doesn't work. The fact that it happens to be completely flat wrong is unfortunate, but not uncommon.
Yeah, I think it's the idea that people are making these decisions based on emotional, be it known or unknown, decisions, that these humans at the top of the, people think that large corporations are these mystical beasts, but there are just regular humans at all different levels making decisions. And sometimes those decisions are very well thought out. And sometimes those decisions are, like you said, driven by, I had an idea when I walked into this room. And even though you've presented me with contrasting information, it wasn't strong enough to change the emotional connection that I had to this idea. So I'm just going to put that forward. The number of our clients who come to us, and let's say they're in the I don't know, fintech space, and we ask them to like bring in things that are important, like, that are interesting to them, they almost always bring in other fintech companies. Like, they've just gone and looked at every other fintech company and put that down as their competitor. Now, very interestingly, a friend of mine works at a big chicken company called Nando's, which I think has expanded quite successfully in the US. And they did a piece of research, and you would think, they were looking at competitors. Who are their biggest competitors? And it turns out their biggest competitor was one of the supermarkets. Yeah. Because the person who was making the decision to buy the chicken for the family was also in the supermarket. So, the decision was, I know Nando's chicken is better, and I know my family will like it more, but I am in the shop right now, and there's a similar quality chicken right there. And I can
Yeah.
save myself an entire
Yeah.
journey to things. So then they started to figure out, how do we now get around this? Because you're not going to change that human behavior. And if anything, it's going to get entrenched, because their competitor, this is a big company called Woolworths, would just get better and better at making chicken.
Yeah.
And then that their value prop goes up and up and up, and
Yeah.
yours becomes less and less interesting over time. And all of a sudden you find yourself in a tricky place.
Yeah. No, it's true, and I wanted to come back to that point you were just making about decision making. I think that I've sat in rooms with quite a number of very senior decision makers, CEOs who are making decisions that are quite material about their brand and their positioning and their value proposition and their identity, whatever it may be, right? And it's very apparent that the vast majority do not know what they're being asked to make a decision about. And I
Mm.
think, and when I say people are ignorant, I don't mean that pejoratively. I don't mean ignorant as in stupid. I mean ignorant as in just don't know, because they've never been taught these things. They don't know how much these things matter, and we've done a good job of deprecating the value of a lot of this stuff as we've pushed down this performance marketing road, and then we've tried to create this binary separation between so-called performance marketing and brand marketing, and it creates this insane, asinine conversation that no CEO wants any part of. Um, and so I think it is, if you're somebody who's in that position, you're a senior business decision maker and you're making these decisions that you're probably only going to make once every 3 or 5 years, and you don't know. I think it's okay to be completely open that you don't know.
Mm.
It just means you have to be extra careful about finding a partner who has the expertise that you lack, so that they can guide you in the right direction. And that's totally fine. But the thing you have to then avoid are, for example, the kinds of design agencies or branding agencies that do the same job every time, right? They make every client look the same. So that might be comforting if you don't know, because everything looks great.
Mm.
But then the back of your brain needs to say, but I don't want to look like everybody else. So like, I do think being ignorant is fine, but then you need to do the work to seek out the people that can really help you, whether they be internal employees, external agencies, and really kind of raise the game that way, and educate yourself. At the end of the day, there is an incredible amount of business value inherent in brand assets. And I think the opportunity to create new business value through brand assets is typically higher in less branded categories. And so the places where people are the most ignorant are the places in the categories where people are the most ignorant are actually the categories that offer the most opportunity. It's
Mm.
much harder to create a stellar, compelling new brand in a category that's already incredibly well branded. You need the only way you're going to break through into sneakers, for example, is you need Nike to literally destroy itself, which is what it did this year. I think brand ignorance, right? The biggest story of brand ignorance in 2024, probably this century so far, has been how Nike literally blew both its feet off with a shotgun, because it overestimated its brand value. It overestimated its ability to shape different behaviors for consumers, and then fundamentally deconstructed the competitive advantage driving business systems that had got it to where it is. And it's probably going to take decades to get that company back what it lost. So it's really hard to win in a category like that unless you've got somebody like a Nike busily destroying itself.
Mm.
Uh, but if you take a category like, I don't know, some kind of enterprise software category, you take something that's really ugly and then you bring a brand into it, it can make a huge difference. Look at Chiquita with bananas. Um, like, it's a dominant brand in banana.
Yeah.
um, and you might not think that matters, but it does, right? So I think that the more you look around you and you see a lack of branding competence, or everything might look nice but it all looks the same and all this kind of stuff, those are the opportunities, I think. And not just visually. I'm mentioning visuals because of things you can see, but obviously the under the water part of the iceberg too.
Mm. No, that is it's we fundamentally believe that if you invest in your brand, you can create a business asset. Like, if you activate your brand in the right way, in the right channels, it should be a revenue driver for the business. And I think there's, in a way, a disconnect between the organizational structures that we see, or where the power sits,
Yeah.
and bringing that to life. So obviously the chief financial officer has grown in prominence and power in organizations, and to good effect, because they understand the finances of the business and how to
Yep.
control those. But there's also your chief marketing officers, but I'm not sure if they've achieved that same level. I mean, a lot of the clients we work with, the marketing team is sometimes somebody who's given a promotion from the front desk, or
Yeah.
or moved sideways. These are not professionals who've like built an entire career around this kind of stuff, and they can't argue in the boardroom to the same quality or level as the other people can.
It's this, you're hitting on, I think, one of the fundamental core problems at the heart of a lot of businesses right now. So CFOs are no longer just the finance people as we used to think of them, right? The CFO is now being asked to manage asset allocation, resource allocation for the company. And their remit is to allocate assets and resources to the places where that corporation is going to get the most value, right? And they have largely decided that value creating activities are not happening in the marketing department for whatever reason, right? And we can see the evidence around us. In the US, marketing budgets in the last 4 years, on average, have declined by 30%. That's a huge drop, like massive. I think it's gone from like 8% of revenue to 11% of revenue to 8 on average. So when you see things like that, that's significant, right? And then when you see that so few marketers are trained, I think less than 27% of marketers have any formal training in the US. And these are US stats because I'm in the US. I only have access to those because I use those every day. But and then if you look at boards, less than 2% of boards have anybody with any marketing experience. And then so we just see this widespread deprecation of the marketing function. It's now being managed for efficiency rather than growth, which is nuts because you don't manage growth activities by trying to make it more and more efficient, right? What you do is you pump money into those activities because they're driving growth. And I think what's happened is the ad tech kind of industrial complex has sold this vision that is largely spurious around like the one-to-one marketing. We hit your consumers exactly when they're ready to buy. Everything will be perfectly efficient, and it's completely nonsensical. And it's really concerning to me because if you look at any other piece of the business, right? So you look at manufacturing, you look at R&D, you look at HR, you look at ops, you look at any of these functions. If you told those business functions, you need to take a 30% haircut, and we expect increased performance out the other side of your 30% haircut, go, right? They would fall over. You can't do it. You can't cut to grow. We know this. This isn't new news, right? And so in the US, what we've seen is because of the inflationary price rises, which, every company piled onto, their profitability is looking good to Wall Street. But when you look at the volume declines, you're like, ooh, there's a problem being built into your business right now, and it's going to hurt really bad at some point in the future when the economy starts to go down, because those volume declines are going to be really hard to get back. And then when they have to get into hard discounting just to stay in the game from where it's going to be
goes away.
Yeah, it's going to be really difficult. And so I think that I have this view that I've said on a few podcasts now. Like, we talk a lot about marketers having to become much more effective at talking the language of finance. It's absolutely true. Not debating that. But the bigger problem, and it is a much bigger problem, is that CFOs are largely ignorant of the contribution of marketing to value creation. And they're managing it for efficiency. And it is literally, it is constraining the growth prospects of the companies that they work for. And we're starting to see Wall Street analysts pick up on this, and they're starting to query CEOs much more on their marketing investments and spend. And so we're seeing CEOs say the right things on earnings calls. But when you look at the actual allocation of resources in terms of building the brand versus running, Google ads, it's all going into the Google ads. So there's no long-term value being created there.
Mm. I think it's also, I mean, as you were talking, you reminded me of a story from my childhood. I mean, the beer brands in South Africa, we grew up, we had, all the sort of sanctions globally. So all of the brands we had were like locally grown brands,
Yep.
and there wasn't an infinite market. So we didn't have many brands, but people, the brands all built these like deep, long emotional connections with the consumers that were buying them. I can remember arriving at a family friend's house, and my father went into, everyone, all the men had bars in the 80s. That was like your symbol of middle class success, as you had a bar in your rec room. So he went to the
Mm-hmm.
bar, looked in the fridge, and there was none of his brand of beer. So he went outside, he got in his car, and he drove home to go and get his beer. He was so loyal to that product that he refused to drink even a free competitor's product. And now the brand marketing is so tactical, as in this is an interesting new mechanic, or something fun. There's a thing on the package that shines blue. There's this, it's extra cold. All of these, like, I don't know, sort of quite surface level, very light entertaining pieces. And you can see it in how the market share shifts in the markets now. The Heineken's up, then it's down, then the sort of consumers are just flittering around these different brands, picking them up, and nobody has this deep care anymore. So I think as you deprecate that investment and you cut that thing and you start losing that piece, like you said with Nike, it takes a long time to build it back up again, because it's not a let's just go out there and do one quick campaign with an agency and we'll be back where we are. Like, once people move on, it's much harder to get them back than it is to sort of maintain that relationship with them and double down
Yeah.
into it.
Yeah, with Nike, I think that the biggest thing they're going to have a huge challenge in dealing with is that they pulled their shoes out of the wholesale channels. So you could no longer find them at retail. They were now trying to exclusively sell through their own DTC website. Trying to get those shoes back on those shelves after having basically screwed over those wholesalers is not going to happen anytime soon. And in
Yeah.
the meantime, that's why Hoka and OnCloud are gaining huge share relative to where they started. And it's not because any marketing excellence per se. It's because when Nike pulled out of retail stores, there were gaps on the wall, and those retail stores had to fill those gaps. And so those brands became, they just got a huge distribution lift.
Mm.
What are you going to do? The only way I think Nike gets back on those shelves is if they pay for the privilege. And so again, that's going to be come through and reduced financial performance in that business for years in order to just get them back to where they already were. It's a huge error of ego. And I think also, interestingly, again, coming back to what I said, less than 2% of boards have any marketing experience on the board. When they hired the CEO of enterprise software maker ServiceNow to become the CEO of Nike, I mean, in all honesty, the board of Nike should all be fired, because they approved his hire, they approved his strategy, and all of this value destruction has happened on their watch. And it was entirely predictable that this would be the outcome. Like,
Mm.
there is innumerable empirical studies and innumerable examples of DTC failure where you could see this. The writing was on the wall from the beginning. So if anybody should actually be hauled over the coals for this one, it's actually the board of Nike, and they should all summarily be fired. They have witnessed massive shareholder value destruction on their watch, and it was
Mm.
entirely preventable.
I like that. What did you call it? A catastrophe of ego, which
It
I
was
think
a
is
catastrophe ego. because they in order for the DTC strategy of Nike to have worked, Nike would have to be a stronger brand than pretty much any other brand on earth. Even Apple doesn't exclusively sell through Apple stores. Let's put it in that context, right? And they didn't even have physical stores of their own. They were trying to push it entirely digitally. They were getting very greedy. They wanted to see tech-like margins in a consumer good, which was never going to happen. And they pursued this, and they predicted pandemic era shopping behavior online would last forever, which is exceptionally naive. So yeah, I think that was just a massive board level failure.
No. I mean, I normally like to end the episodes on a like a high point. So I'm going to ask you one more question, which is, if you were guiding someone who is looking at making a decision like this, how do you think, what do people need to think about when they're making these kinds of decisions so that they don't fall into those ego traps?
I think that so one of the reasons that the marketing services environment, creative agencies, et cetera, have found themselves in a bit of pickle in recent years is I think there's a lot of snake oil sellers in our business. And so I think if you're making a decision, the first thing you have to decide is who are you being advised by and how do I know these people really know what they're talking about? I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is you should do a little bit of your own due diligence. If you are ignorant of how brands work and how marketing works and everything else, it's not hard to dig up information on this subject. So do a bit of due diligence. Look at what people like Byron Sharp are saying. Look at what people like the Ehrenberg Institute are doing. Look at what people like Mark Ritson likes to talk about. There's a mini MBA. There's a ton of stuff out there. You read my newsletter. But on a serious note, right? Make sure that you're not being sold a bill of goods, right? And then work through. And I think in the case of Nike, it's very specific. That was a business systems problem, right? They literally tried to disrupt the entirety of their value chain. And I think if you're going to do that, you got to look really carefully at each element of that and make a much better choice. I think if it's looking more at how do we position the brand, what's the visual identity going to be, et cetera, I think just educate yourself and remember some basic things like our job is not to look like the rest of the category. The job is to stand out from the category, right? The value proposition isn't to be like everybody else's unless we've got some other reason that gives us a benefit. And I think my experience is that the strongest brands are the ones where the core kind of source of differentiation is inherent to the business systems and cultural norms of that company. Meaning, if you try to position yourself as just this idea in the ether that's unrelated to anything, it's really difficult to pull that off. But if you find something that's inherent to how your company is structured or inherent, like, for example, we did a banking job where we focused really hard on simplicity because relative to every other bank of a similar scale, this one's corporate structure was radically simpler. And so they could, and it was already kind of in the ethos of the business. That was very successful. And so I think it's way easier to base what you do on things that you find from the inside that have a clear Venn diagram overlap with the outside. I think it's when you try to position and create this world of artifice that's completely off to one side, that's really hard to pull off. And not just hard to buy, it's hard to pull it off. Because you need to be able to fake every single detail. That's a lot of work.
Yeah, a lot of work, a lot of money, and then as soon as you're feeling constrained in any way, those are probably the first things that get cut. And then then the story falls to pieces.
Yes, exactly. That it's like they gave the example very beginning of what Ralph Lauren with Polo, right? He built incredible artifice around that. It makes you feel like you're of that world, right? But if the cracks started forming, you lose it really quick.
Yeah. Well, Paul, that was a very good conversation, and it's testament to the fact that we're now running long. So I mean, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing some of your thoughts with us. And I've got a few notes to take away and think about, like especially around this idea of where potentially is your ego getting in the way of what you should actually be focusing on, is a really powerful thought for me. So thank you for coming on the podcast. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you for having me. And I'm really impressed we managed to speak for all this time and we never touched on any of the things we talked about we were going to focus on, which is, I guess, a sign of a good conversation.
Yes. Excellent. And I will catch you all in the next one. Bye-bye.